Dear colleagues, my paper is focused on the ethical topic that is usually treated in the context of the theological virtue of charity. It is the Ordo Caritatis, or the Order of Charity, or Order of Divinely Infused Love. I will compare Hurtado with his colleagues from medieval and Renaissance scholasticism, Tomáš Aquinas and Francisco Suarez. Hurtado de Mendoza presents his concept in the treatise De Tribus Virtutibus Theologicis. Suarez focuses on this order of charity in the treatise De Caritate in the 12th volume of the opera Omnia edited by Vives, and Aquinas devoted the 26th question of the Secunda Secundae to that question. I don't know if it is possible to see it from the last, the opposite side of the room, but maybe something. Here you can see a comparison of questions or sections in the writings of these three authors that are focused on the order of charity. All of three named authors are in agreement with one another concerning the following hierarchy. First, God. The second, proper soul. The third, the soul of a neighbor. The fourth, proper body. And fifth, neighbor's temporal goods. Let us start with the absolute priority of God. While Suarez discusses this point only very briefly, stating that dignity of beloved object means the most perfect act of charity, Hurtado de Mendoza deals with this topic rather in detail. There are several ways of describing the reasons why God stands in the first place of the order of charity according to him. First, measure of charity depends on beloved good, and it is God who is the highest good. Next, the charity towards creatures is derived from the charity towards God. That's why it is not possible to love creature more than God. The law orders to love God for the sake of him and to love man for the sake of God. In this context, Hurtado speaks rather radically. If God had wanted us to lose the glory or to be annihilated because of him, we should have wanted it because we must love God more than us. Such a statement, however, is really questionable because a good is a concord with a concupiscence or desire, and here the creative will of God, proceeding from the divine idea of the human nature, would be incompatible with God's, how to say it, damnational or annihilative will. The concept is either contradictory in itself or it is setting out to the voluntarist concept of good. Next, charity towards God is a precept, but charity towards our neighbor is, according to Hurtado, it is not a precept. This holds true for the Mosaic Decalogue, and it must be said that in the New Testament text, the charity towards neighbor is understood as a part of the charity towards God. Next, we wish God a higher good because God himself is the highest good and most worthy of good. To sum up these points, we can conclude Hurtado's concept of charity considers God as the source of charity, which is consistent because the charity is divinely infused virtue, and consequently, our charity towards God is higher than the charity towards creatures. Our returning of the charity to its originator, God, is the ground that any other charity proceeds from. The other way of reasoning deals with the biblical texts on law or precepts. Let's compare this argumentation with Aquinas, who sets up his reasoning philosophically in the concept of friendship, which is the foundation of every kind of love, including charity. Friendship means sharing of good among friends. He continues with reference to the theological concept of eternal happiness. The friendship of charity is based on sharing of this happiness. God is the cause of the eternal happiness, so that He is loved the most. Our neighbors are loved depending on God as the beings that can share with us this good of the eternal happiness. In one respect, Aquinas' reasoning is similar to both Jesuits, who established their concepts on the highest good. Aquinas' position and argumentation, however, is less ontological and more relational. A reference to law, as it is in Hurtado, is missing in Aquinas' text. According to Hurtado, the basic good that cannot be offered is human salvation. Everything what is not ordered by law can be offered for the sake of the eternal salvation. The basic idea is a priority of salvation. An important clause, however, is the condition what is not ordered by law. For the sake of the eternal salvation of our neighbor, it is not possible to commit neither mortal nor venial sin. The reason of this principle is clear and traditional. It is not possible to do any evil as a mean for any good. It is impossible for the charity to want anything contradictory to God's will. A sin is contrary to God's will. If the rational motive of our activity for the sake of neighbor's salvation is the charity, it is not possible to sin at all. Proper spiritual good has a priority to others, because everybody is closer to himself than to others. And if God is loved in the first place, then I must want God in the first place, and anything other, including the salvation of my neighbors, is in the second place. Aquinas presents clear argumentation. God is a principle of good, and neighbor is a person who participates with us in this good. There is no good without God. That's why God is in the first place. I am in the second place because I am closer to myself than to others, who are in the third place. Hurtado presents some objection from the scripture. There are two texts that are mentioned by both Hurtado and Suarez in this context. It is Exodus 32. Moses prays to God to forgive the sin of Israelites or to remove him from the book of life. And similar text is in the New Testament in the letter to Romans, 9th chapter. Paul says he wants to be even cursed for the salvation of his brethren Jews. Both Moses and Paul seem to prefer their neighbors to their own salvation. Let us look at the Suarez argumentation here. The first point is really surprising. Paul supposedly speaks from ignorance he had before his conversion to Christ. However, Suarez doesn't take this reasoning too seriously, and he prefers another explanation of this text. According to him, Paul speaks in hyperbole to underline emotionally the meaning of the salvation of Jews. It is in concord with the old church fathers' explanations. It is about his bodily death, Paul's bodily death, this curse, not spiritual death. Hurtado uses similar explanation by this hyperbole. It was the question whether a man can offer his own salvation for the sake of a neighbor's salvation. The answer is, of course, negative. However, spiritual harm is not always connected with sin, and with a loss of salvation. Such a, how to say it, weaker spiritual harm is admitted by Hurtado for the sake of the salvation of a neighbor. It is possible, he says, to postpone my own salvation for the sake of my neighbor. My own salvation is not lost in this case, but only postponed. Suarez illustrates such case by example of a person who doesn't become a religious friar or sister because of the benefit of other people. Hurtado argues similarly, but a little more generally. To sum up, Hurtado, in harmony with many other authors, doesn't accept loss of my salvation because of any reason. However, he admits own spiritual detriment for the sake of other people. It is not fatal danger for my salvation. If we move from the level of soul to the level of temporal goods, Hurtado is rather radical. Not only we can, but we must offer our bodily life for the sake of salvation of others, if they are in extreme spiritual necessity. Discussing the concept of extreme necessity, Hurtado presents some examples obviously inspired by Jesuit or other missions in America and East Asia. For example, he discusses the situation of a missionary who should baptize a child in the mortal danger, even if he himself is mortally endangered by this baptism. Spiritual welfare of a child has a priority to the bodily welfare of a missionary. In this question, Hurtado is in harmony with Aquinas and Suarez. Nevertheless, they differ in a way of argumentation and in particular emphasis of these authors. Aquinas concentrates on clear understanding of the cure about the soul and cure about a body. My neighbor participates in the eternal beatitude or happiness through his or her soul that is more lovable than our body that participates in beatitude or happiness only through an overflowing of grace and happiness from our soul to our body. On the other hand, we have an obligation to care about our body. We are obliged to care about the salvation of any neighbor only in the case of extreme necessity. It means when there is a harm of immediate eternal damnation. If there is no extreme necessity, we are not obliged to die for the sake of our neighbor, according to Aquinas, but he admits that it belongs to the perfect charity. Arguments for stating the neighbor's salvation prior to our body are presented in Suarez 2. It is possible to mention, for example, that God can be glorified in the soul of my neighbor more than in my own body, and that's why the soul of my neighbor has a priority to my body. He emphasizes the obligation of offering our bodily life with reference to the commandment of Christ from the Gospel of John, 15th chapter. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Similarly to Aquinas, Hurtado limits an obligation of offering bodily life only to extreme necessity. Comparing Aquinas and Suarez with Hurtado, we must say Hurtado doesn't present such concise and clear argumentation like them. He deals with practical questions more. It is possible to mention some exceptions from the strict obligation of offering my own bodily life for the sake of the eternal salvation of my neighbor. For example, it is the situation of a person who would enter the danger of mortal sin and consequently damnation or the situation of a person who has closer neighbors who depend on him in their eternal salvation. The first example is not really problematic. Aquinas and Suarez don't write about it, but they would surely agree with Hurtado. It returns to the preceding question about priority of my own salvation. The second case is more interesting, I think. Hurtado seems to discuss practical experiences and ethical dilemmas of missionaries who can face the dilemma whether to offer bodily life for the sake of salvation of unknown foreign person, being responsible to natives who are entrusted to his pastoral care and who depend on him as a priest, the servant of the sacraments necessary for salvation. The last part of this topic is the order among the temporary goods. The most important temporary good, of course, is own bodily life. It's a section 4, Ordo inter temporalia proximi and et propria. The most important is the bodily life. We discussed the preference of soul to body, but what about the relation of two bodily lives? It's an interesting part of Hurtado's treatise because he argues there for the priority of my own bodily life to the lives of other people. The special problem here is murder and suicide. For example, in Aquinas' texts, it is discussed in completely different contexts. And the fourth section of the last section of Hurtado's treatise opens the different point of view to the order of charity, where is the separate problem, a question of priority of one person to another. For example, in the level of spiritual welfare or eternal happiness, or at the level of bodily life, and so on, where is no difference between, or no priority between spiritual and bodily. It is, am I obliged to prefer mother or father, son or daughter, or other relatives, etc.? It's worth saying Aquinas devoted more than a half of his question on this order of charity in this context of this topic. But it is not the topic for this lecture. If God and reviewers give their grace to publication of my paper, you will find it lately in the book. To sum up all the question or all the disputation or all the treatise about the order of charity, it is possible to say that Hurtado is in perfect harmony with the traditional teaching that can be found, for example, in Aquinas or church fathers. It is not anything radically new. But there are some interesting places, interesting points that worth seeing and reading and discussing. For example, the new, as I mentioned, the new examples from the situation of missionaries, etc., etc. Aquinas' text or Suarez' text is more argumentative. It's there are a lot of arguments, a lot of reasonings, a lot of syllogisms, and so on. Hurtado's text is his arguments, his thoughts, his statements are scattered in such a interesting but something complicated mosaic. But I think the practical dimension of Hurtado's text some special questions, new questions, etc., are the reason why Hurtado's text is also interesting, and it worth our interest and reading. It is not the similar case like, for example, in logic or metaphysics, where Hurtado is really innovative author. Here he is more traditional, but only with some small and not very important, but sometimes interesting points. Thank you very much. That's all from me.